Welcome to OVIDcasts. I'm Roudie Shafie, partner here at OVID Health. And welcome to episode 2 of our mini-series on vaccination with Professor David Salisbury. Hi, David.
Hello.
Great. So, David, we, in our first episode, had a great discussion around some of the global trends around vaccination. Today, I want to deep dive into a slightly more niche issue around the JCVI. So the JCVI really came to public consciousness around the COVID pandemic. It was a body not many people had, well, certainly in the general public, had never heard of. And more interestingly, even from a political sense, it came more into light. And for the first time, we saw politicians challenge decisions that were, or advice that was previously universally accepted. So it begs the question, is it still fit for purpose?
Oh, I think it's fit for purpose. Its purpose is to get expert, independent advice on immunization and immunization programs. So I think, yes, it is fit for purpose. It is independent, it is expert, and it does give advice. And so I think it fulfills those functions.
What are the rooms for improvement then?
Well, I think you have to compare the JCVI against the similar advisory boards from other countries. And for most of the criteria, I think JCVI stands very high, and it does have very great international recognition and respect for the quality of the work it does. So I think that in that regard, it does a very good job. There are differences in the way it operates. The US equivalent, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, for instance, holds open meetings, and they're available in real time online, so you know exactly what everybody has said. Other national equivalents don't do that. For instance, the US is the exception, I think, there. And the UK handling of JCVI and that openness is similar to many other countries, particularly other European advisory boards. But I think it is a question that is fair to ask about who said what and what did they actually say and how much did what they say influence the conclusion. When all you get is the minute of the meeting, remember that that's filtered. You know, that's been through many people's hands to get to the final published version. And you don't get some of the vibrancy of listening to the debate and getting an insight into how clear some of the recommendations were, whether they were unanimous or indeed whether there was some tension in how you get to the conclusion. Hitherto, the recommendations of JCVI, in my experience, were always accepted by government, and I can only think of one occasion when government sent a JCVI bit of advice back, and that was a very long time ago, and actually I think they were right to send it back as it happened, because it did need more work. More recently, the JCVI advice has indeed been accepted, but during the COVID experience, I think we've had insights into quite how difficult it is to take the rather purist scientific advice and then how it gets adapted into the wider political environment, particularly when the economy is actually going to be considerably impacted by what the JCVI actually recommends. So it's changing. Now, quite how that will go in the future is very difficult to predict. And it may be that as the work goes back to more traditional evaluation of vaccines and recommendations, it may be the case that these are universally accepted. But who knows? You know, we may have another pandemic and we may have all of the impacts that we currently have been experiencing. And so the politics will play in again. You know, the fact that the chief medical officers heard the JCVI advice and then felt that they needed to take a more broad consideration of that advice and felt that something different should happen. That's the first time.
That is such a great point about the balance of power. Do you feel that there needs to be a review of the relationship between, I guess, the JCVI and the ministerial office?
I don't think it needs to be reviewed. I think it's going to evolve. And I think that, we've had things happen that hadn't happened before. And so they will influence the way some of the decisions happen in the future, because when there had never been an event of the JC, apart from the one relatively trivial one I can think of, but the advice was accepted. And now we've got a different perspective, that the political implications and the sort of holistic impact is being thought about by politicians rather than just the health effect. That may continue. We'll see.
That's really, really interesting. I remember during the pandemic, we had a discussion, David, and you felt that this sort of almost called in a new era where perhaps broader considerations beyond the narrow view of cost effectiveness will start coming into play. I think you mentioned specifically around sort of RSV as a disease area where sort of considering wider societal impact may tip the balance, whereas before it wouldn't have. Do you still feel that way? Do you still see that evolution happening?
I think the evolution is happening. I think RSV is not particularly relevant to the debate. It will be one of the next big issues that's going to be discussed, thought about, potentially accepted and implemented. So it has currency, but the debate remains. And the debate, I think, is whether we should still use the very narrow health costs and benefits, or take a wider view about some of those indirect costs and benefits. I think that there is indeed a move towards acknowledging those wider issues, and particularly some of the long-term issues about the impact of disease, infectious disease, on, for example, subsequent education and subsequent skill level. And so, looking at long-term consequences rather than just the short-term will, I think, be far more acceptable. There are problems, though. And one of the problems is, do we use the same criteria for cost effectiveness for vaccines and other therapeutics? And if we argue that vaccines are special and should not be held to the same criteria as other therapeutics, we have to justify why indeed they are special. And I think that's a hurdle that's got to be overcome. Either everything changes, the cost effectiveness for other therapeutics and vaccines, or we argue and it's accepted why vaccines should be handled differently. So I think that that's all still to play, and it's not going to be specific to any one vaccine. It will be part of the bigger issue. The other thing that the COVID pandemic has thrown up, and I think that we will come back to this on occasions ahead of us, and that is the wider economic impact of infectious disease. And it's been clear that for the COVID pandemic, we've been looking far wider at just the health impacts. And the economic impacts of the pandemic actually, I think, were the bigger consideration than just health. And so that hadn't happened before. I think in the future, particularly when we look at the possibility of another influenza pandemic, we'll look at the economic impact across society rather than just the direct health costs.
No, that's absolutely right, and I agree with you that is something that should definitely be looked at. And it's interesting you mentioned sort of other therapeutics. Obviously, NICE is the body that looks at vaccines coming down the line. And you mentioned earlier transparency. So NICE has been on a journey. They're now much more engaged with even patients and patient groups representing people in those disease areas they may be evaluating against. They publish notes, they hold public meetings, even so that, you know, would there be a case for just moving the JCVI into NICE and I guess having a single structure under which and a single way of working under which some of these decisions can be made, as opposed to have them in this new sort of larger public health institution?
I mean, this is not a new challenge, as it were, to JCVI. This has come up on a number of occasions over many years. JCVI uses the same criteria for economic evaluation as NICE does.
Yes.
So there is a level playing field there. The advantage of JCVI is that it is composed of experts in immunization and also in implementation. And I think that you can't have technical expertise on vaccines without bringing in practical expertise on implementation of a vaccine program. The other, I think, essential difference is that NICE gives advice essentially for the individual. It's for the benefit to the individual from a particular therapy. The purpose of a vaccine program is for the whole community, be it all children, be it all people who are within a particular age bracket, or all people with a particular risk condition. And I think it's that universality of the population being the recipient of a vaccine program that speaks for keeping JCVI as it is. I think that as long as there is a carry across between the criteria that JCVI is using and the criteria that NICE uses, I don't see there is particular benefit from a merger.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And this marks the end of our second episode.